And just one day after Derek Chauvin was found guilty of murdering George Floyd here in the Bay Area, a Danville police officer has been charged with voluntary manslaughter and for a shooting that took place following a car chase in 2018. So is there something that these officers could have done differently during these interactions with suspects? And how are officers trained to even handle tense, high-stress situations like this? Joining us now is Officer Scott Savage, the owner of Savage Training Group out of San Jose. Officer Savage, thanks for joining us.
No, thanks for having me.
A lot to cover with regard to this topic. Let's just start with your law enforcement background and what prompted you to form your training group.
Yeah, listen, I've been a police officer in California for 21 years, and I just really wasn't satisfied, with the level of training that not only I was receiving, but officers around me were receiving. So decided to do something about it and launched a training group. Our mission's very simple, just the bar of law enforcement training, not only in California, but across the U.S.
Now, you say you aren't satisfied. What are the issues, in your opinion, with the training, with use of force conduct, and how widespread do you think these issues really are? I know we see these problems across the country, various law enforcement agencies, really across the United States. But where do you think the issues lie, and why were you not satisfied with, let's say, the training that you were receiving?
Right. I mean, even in the latest trial that we all watched, there was certainly a lot of talk about police training. There was talk about what training an officer may or may not have received. What wasn't discussed was, did learning occur? Did any learning actually occur? In other words, is sitting in a training class, being present, attending, does that equal learning? And if learning did occur, is that officer able to recall it when it matters most under the real circumstances we work under? So maybe some of the things we're trying to do is just really take a deep dive into how people learn, and more importantly, how people recall information under those circumstances you mentioned, which are always tense, uncertain, rapidly unfolding. So that's kind of where the magic is, as opposed to sending officers to just maybe more training, right? There's a lot of cry, hey, the officers should go to this kind of training or that kind of training. Is it more or is it better training that we need to be focused on? I'd argue the latter.
Yeah, you mentioned, in our discussion prior to setting up this interview, a lot of people do talk about the number of hours. Police officers aren't trained enough. But it's not a matter of necessarily being trained enough. It's just being trained smart.
Right. And maybe we need as a society to decide on what is it exactly that we want officers to do? What does good look like? And then let's backward design that. So let's start with the outcome. This is what a high-performing, great officer looks like. Let's then figure out, how do we get that person there? And I can tell you quite plainly, just sitting in front of a class, right? We've all been there. The death by PowerPoint types of classes, that's not going to do it. The check the box stuff isn't going to do it. If we hope to kind of move our industry forward in law enforcement training and then law enforcement in general, we've got to embrace what academia is telling us, what the research is telling us, and kind of the old way of doing things. That's the way we've always done it. Really just isn't good enough anymore.
It's very similar when you speak. It reminds me a lot of when I was in law school. It's like you learn all these things in law school, but you don't really know how to become a lawyer until you're out there and kind of in a real life situation. In your example, the death by PowerPoint, you can have bullet points of what to be done, but there is a human nature when it comes to a person's reaction when they're put in a certain high stress situation, and those bullet points, I don't want to say they necessarily go out the window, but to some degree, unless a person is in that situation repeatedly, it's difficult to kind of learn the proper way to respond in that situation. Am I right?
Right. Hearing information in a classroom is great for building knowledge, but we need to build in scenarios. We need to build in actual simulators that are going to simulate the environment that we want someone to perform in. It's no different than what happens in medicine, what happens with elite athletes or elite military units. These are high performers. Well, how'd they get there? Through good training. And check the box mindsets of just saying, well, the officer should go to this training or that training. It isn't going to cut it any more than trying to just add more policies and more rules. Those are compliance issues. Something different is learning, is performance. That's a very different thing. And I would argue quite strongly that that's where the real secret lies to us kind of moving things forward.
Now, how do you, in your opinion, think you can simulate something like that? You mentioned, doctors in medical school, you're a resident, you'll be put in a hospital setting with someone kind of overlooking any operation or any treatment that you're providing a patient. But simulating that same level of high stress, unless you're actually in that situation, is, in my mind, kind of difficult. Unless you're faced with a deadly situation where if you act wrong, you may be killed. It could be, it's got to be hard to simulate something like that. How would you recommend that, you know, a law enforcement agency, a training agency, how would they do something like that?
Well, I see two things there. You know, there's actually a lot of smart folks that are working on this, and it doesn't get a lot of attention in the media. It's just not quite as, you know, as sensational as some other stuff. But there's a ton of people working on this, from simulator developers to behavioral researchers, looking at the way humans perform. Because police officers like me, we're just humans, right? We're bound by human performance capability. So there's a lot of research in that. We just need to kind of embrace it. But the other thing is, quite plainly, it's going to take an investment of money. It's going to take an investment of money to get that kind of high fidelity, high quality training, if we hope to kind of move things forward. And I'm not sure, you know, we're quite there yet. So there's going to be a holistic approach. Sure, it's policy, it's supervision, it's making sure we hire the right folks, but there is a huge training component to this. And if we really want officers to perform in the field like we all hope they will, we need to take a really hard look at the way they're trained, because I think the public would not be as impressed if they saw all the training that's occurring on a conventional level. There's some great stuff out there, but there's also some stuff that needs to be updated and improved upon.
You mentioned money. Defunding police is something that a lot of people have been talking about since this whole George Floyd situation happened last year. If training programs need money to implement proper training protocols and simulate, you know, certain scenarios, defunding the police would take away from that to some degree, right?
Sure. And, you know, without getting into slogans, I think the point of most rational people is that maybe we need to take money away from law enforcement budgets and put it towards, you know, better outreach for the mentally ill, the homeless, people suffering from drug addiction. And I really don't think that's anything that anybody would argue against. But it is also true, if we want officers to perform in a way that we can all be proud of on both kind of sides of the equation, that is going to take money. And defunding that, my fear is that because training is a line item budget in most cities and most municipalities, that's something that can be cut. In other words, there is no line item budget for police response to the homeless, police response to, you know, narcotics calls. That it's going to be something like training. And I think that's a big mistake. So maybe as opposed to defunding, we need to be thinking more of how do we develop, right? How do we develop those officers out in the field? We all benefit from it.
Now, the use of force typically comes from an escalation of a particular situation. So de-escalation has to be a big thing when it comes to training police officers, law enforcement officials. Can you explain to our viewers the concept of de-escalation when it comes to encounters with the police, what the current training is in that area, if there is, let's say, a standard that police officers kind of have to meet? And do you think the current training with regard to de-escalation is effective or where it needs to be?
That word de-escalation can mean many different things to many different folks and many different training providers. And so while there are some various definitions of that, we as a society and maybe police trainers as a whole need to kind of decide, what does it look like when someone de-escalates? And this mindset that de-escalation is something an officer can do to somebody is erroneous, right? I've been a cop for 21 years. I do not possess the superhuman power to control others. No matter all the training I've been to and all the skills I have, I don't have the ability to reach out and say, you're de-escalated, right? De-escalation is actually more like a noun, a person, place, or a thing, right? It's something we can offer to people. We can offer de-escalation and say, sir, we'd like to de-escalate the situation with you. I need you to put down that bat, and I need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back. Ultimately, though, that subject, that suspect, that other person gets a vote. They get a vote in whether this situation will be de-escalated. So I think it's, again, super important we become real clear on what it looks like. What does good look like? And then we'll backwards engineer this on how we're going to train it. Simply, sending cops to class to say, hey, you're going to learn how to talk to people better. That's a piece of it, but that's also just a piece of it. So there's a lot that goes into that. And again, let's decide on what those behaviors are that we want and then we'll work backwards. And train to that standard.
And you say there's a lot that goes into it. There's no doubt that these use of force policies and just this police brutality situation is a very, very complex, multifaceted kind of issue. One big thing that a lot of people talk about is the racial bias when it comes to the contact that a police officer has with, let's say, a civilian. How do you think agencies, law enforcement agencies, or police officers that are training other police officers, how would you recommend that they fight implicit bias when it comes to policing? Because when you look at, let's say, the jails, they are disproportionately populated by certain races, people of color typically. When you look at certain areas, are very, very large number, you want to talk about, let's say, the south side of Chicago, large number of people of color. So these police officers are in environments where they are kind of faced with a certain demographic that is either committing crimes, on trial for crimes, or have been convicted of crimes. How do you do away with implicit bias when a person is constantly exposed to something like that? Because not everyone within a certain demographic is a criminal, and there are certain demographics that people don't associate crime with, and there are criminals in that demographic as well. So how do you do away with the implicit bias that kind of is tied into all of this?
Well, that's a tough question. I wouldn't pretend to have the answers to something like that as simply a police officer and a police trainer. What I would say is the first thing we do is we embrace and we trust the research, real research. We seek out research that is scientifically based, empirical, peer-reviewed, actual research in the area. Let's lean on the experts in that area and have them inform us on how to solve these issues. So if there is research that suggests that people have implicit bias and that affects their behavior in the field, and there's a way to screen it, train out of it, whatever, let's embrace that. And similarly, if that research doesn't exist, then we need to find something else, right? Because ultimately what we're talking about is people's behavior in the field, people's performance, these police officers who are just people, performance in the field. That's what we're more concerned about. Yes, it's important to know what's in someone's head, but I think if we lean back on the research, and I just can't help but think it's out there, then we're all better served. It's convening additional panels or bringing, police groups together with community groups is important for communication sense, but just like we wouldn't say to a brain surgeon, I know how to conduct brain surgery. I wouldn't pretend to tell academic researchers and people that study this for a living, how to do their job. We need to really embrace that.
So it really is a case-by-case or person-by-person type of situation. Same question with my next issue is, some people may be leaving the military, joining law enforcement. Those people that are leaving the military, some of them are trained to kill. How do you kind of untrain that mentality? So let's say they're not so aggressive in certain situations, whereas that's what they were trained to do when, fighting a war, for example.
Yeah, it really hasn't been my experience. The military veterans that I've worked with have been some of the most exemplary officers that I've worked with. And as opposed to thinking they're trained to kill, well, they're trained to do a very important job, for this country. And I've had zero experiences with military veterans who become police officers where they're somehow out of control. It's actually the opposite. Found them to be very disciplined, very intelligent, and very good at being clinical, which is what a police officer needs to do, right? Being clinical, meaning seeing something that's occurring, assessing what's happening, applying past knowledge to it, deciding on a good course of action, and then executing that course of action. That's the essence of what police officers do. And some of the military folks that we've hired have been really some of the best cops around.
Yeah, it can't be, I can't imagine a blanket approach really working out, because not every situation, not every person is the same, and not every situation with which they are presented is the same as well. Now, this week there was a historic ruling or turnout in when it comes to this whole police brutality situation. Chauvin was found guilty on all 3 charges that he was facing in the George Floyd murder. What do you think? What lesson, if any, do you think should be learned from that particular case with regard to police training?
Well, I think if you listen back and if the viewers listened to any of the testimony that was given, there was a lot of focus on police training, right? Did the officer attend this course or that course? What specifically was taught? Was the leg supposed to be here? Was the knee supposed to be there? They got very, very specific about police training, and that's good. That's great to be scrutiny about that. But again, was there a lot of talk of, did learning occur? I didn't hear that. Was there any discussion of, how do we know this person, right, this student, Mr. Chauvin, learned something? And how did we determine he's going to be able to perform that adequately in the field, and to what given standard? Again, sometimes a lot of law enforcement training is really sitting in a classroom trying to absorb some information, but would the training that was given that officer, other officers, survive academic scrutiny by teaching professionals, by college professors, by behavioral scientists who measure those types of things? So I think, as opposed to, there's a lot of lessons we could learn from that, but I think one of the key lessons in there is, how are police officers trained? What are they trained in, and to what standard? And when's the last time that curriculum was evaluated, by an independent third party? Who are the experts that could comment on what that is? So it's easy to say, well, we should add 8 hours of more training here, or the officer should go to this type of class. We need to look at, though, what is that training? What is that training? And again, I think the viewers would be surprised and not in a good way, about a lot of conventional police training. There's some great folks out there, great classes out there. There's some departments that are doing amazing things, but that's not everybody.
And that's the problem, I think, with everything, is that there have been a lot of bad actors. That's obviously been coming up in media, a lot of stories that maybe we may not even hear about, but that is putting this cloud over officers that aren't committing those kind of crimes, that aren't using their power or abusing their power or using excessive force when they come into contact with a person of color or a marginalized group. Officer Savage, you're a police officer, so many might think that me asking you this question will prompt a biased response. But do you think that police are facing an unfair amount of scrutiny with everything that's been going on?
I don't think it's unfair. I wouldn't call it unfair, because being in a very high profile job that has a lot of importance to it, of course we're going to be scrutinized, and we should. I am a civilian as well as a police officer, right? I'm in my house and I scrutinize the actions of my local police force. No issue with that. One issue, though, that I would caution people, though, is, are we looking at police officers' performance through the lens of human performance capability, right? Meaning, when you see things like, well, they should shoot the gun out of his hand, they should be able to de-escalate everyone, that's not always possible. And as a matter of fact, it's highly improbable to do something like that. It's asking police officers to operate at 100% perfection and to do an excellent job 100% of the time is never going to happen, because as long as we hire humans to be police officers and not robots, they are bound by human performance limitations, right? Limitations. So what a camera sees is not what the eye sees. What the camera sees doesn't take into consideration the officer's perception, assessment, how his eye was functioning. There's a lot that goes into it. I watch the same viral videos that everyone else does, and I cringe, and I'm emotionally disturbed by the things that I see sometimes by some police officers, but I'm comforted to know that is as a statistically small number of police officers in a statistically small number of instances. By and large, the police do an outstanding job most of the time. So please scrutinize us, put us under a microscope, but also be realistic. Be realistic about what humans, police officers, can actually achieve.
What do you see or would like to see for the future of police training and just police interactions with the community?
I think police training should be improved on a global scale, and I think we should decide as a society what we want police officers to do and kind of agree on those things, and then maybe limit some of the other stuff that police officers have become involved in over the years, so we can really allow time to train and time to focus on core skill sets, right? How to deal with a resisting subject. That would be a core skill set. Conducting car stops and everything that could possibly go right and wrong with that. unfortunately, police work has become watered down over the years with tons of extra subjects and training classes and responsibilities added to that. Maybe we need to go back to the basics, right? We're going to get a higher performing officer if we give them more training. And with that training, we need to take a look at how cops are trained, right? Reevaluate the courses they go to and make sure that they are professional. And everything that word encompasses. The curriculum is sound. It is delivered in a way that's going to embed the information into long-term memory and give that officer the ability to retrieve it in the actual circumstances that they deal with.
And Officer Savage, there's obviously so much information to cover. We just don't have all the time in the world to do this. But if a police officer, let's say, is frustrated with the training that they've received, or perhaps they want to take your training to their agency in the future and get, more information and just possibly just be kind of placed under your wing with all of this, how can they learn more about your program?
Yeah, hop on our website, savagetraininggroup.com. We're on a mission to raise the bar of law enforcement. We have a tremendous number of classes there. I can promise you that the instructors are excellent at what they do. And we spend a lot of time, actually we obsess over the curriculum and making sure it's delivered in a way to where when we ask the students, hey, did learning occur? We can test them, we can prove it occurred. And we're seeing tremendous results from some of the courses out there. So we're trying to be very intentional, very conscientious, very responsible, because we understand the weighty responsibility we have to train police officers. So check out savagetraininggroup.com and you can kind of see what we have to offer there.
Well, Officer Scott Savage, we really, really appreciate your time and kind of giving us like 20 minutes or so of your morning to talk to us about such a big topic today, and a topic that I think, while many people it's fueled by so much, I think it's also important to see people in your position who don't agree with what's going on across the country. And I know there's a lot of officers that don't agree with what's going on. So we really, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us today.
No, thank you.